Hey folks, welcome back. I haven't really seen a good video on camshaft specifications, so I had a couple of requests. I thought I'd do one. This is probably going to be a lot of information, so you may want to pause the video if you need to and go back and get some of the information. But first of all, when you buy a camshaft, and I've got a camshaft here that we're going to put in a customer's big block Ford. This is a billet camshaft. It's a solid roller for a Ford. Pretty typical cam for a high performance engine. But you may have at some time in your past have had somebody rattle off cam specs to you and you had no idea what they were talking about. So you just looked at them and kind of smiled and said, oh wow, sounds awesome. But you really didn't fully grasp what the things they were saying meant to you. I'm going to break those things down. Every camshaft comes with specifications, a cam card if you will, and the cam card for this particular camshaft, I've got it here and it's got a lot of specs on it. So I kind of wanted to walk you through the specifications on this cam and just kind of give you a rundown of what each one of these things means, so the next time somebody rattles off cam specs, or the next time you're looking for a cam, or if you're looking for a cam right now, what you should actually be looking for. You know, one of the reasons that there's not a really one good video that explains everything about camshafts is because it's a huge subject. I mean, there's so many variables that you need to consider when you purchase a cam or when you look at cam profiles and things, and so it's actually a huge subject. But I'm going to just attempt to give you some basic ideas of what these numbers and specifications actually mean when you're looking at them, because I've found that a lot of people, when you start talking about camshaft specs like this, they don't know what you're talking about. They really don't understand this. And a lot of the times people's response is, I just want something that sounds cool, right? Well, it's possible to put in a cam that sounds very cool, but it doesn't run worth a darn because it's not matched to your engine. So these numbers are actually pretty important if you actually want to make some power. Okay, so first of all, we need to define one of the first camshaft specs you're going to run into is you're going to run into a spec called lift. Okay, so lift, and I've made some diagrams here, so hopefully this will help clear up some of the confusion. Lift is actually the distance that the valve opens. So when the valve is closed, the rocker arm, your rocker arm is up here, so we've got our roller rocker arm. Your rocker arm is up here, and when the camshaft is on the base circle, or in other words, you are not on the cam lobe. I've got a cam lobe here. When your lifter is over here on the base circle of the cam, and every cam lobe, you got to understand, is ground on a base circle. So when the cam is in a position where the lifter is anywhere on this base circle, that means that the valve in the engine is closed. It's seated. As the lifter rides the profile of this lobe, the lifter is going to come up, this lobe is rotating, and the lifter is going to ride the profile of the lobe. What that does is that's going to push on your push rod. So you have a lifter riding the profile of the lobe, you have a push rod here, the push rod is connected to the rocker arm bone. And so the push rod, so as we ride the profile of that lobe, the push rod is going to push on this rocker arm, and this rocker arm in turn is going to push that valve open. The distance that valve is pushed open by this rocker arm, from the time it leaves the seat till it is fully extended, that distance measured in inches or thousandths of an inch is your camshaft's lift. Now, the lift of the cam can vary greatly depending on what camshaft you pick. So literally what determines lift on your cam is how far off of the base circle, this lobe is machined. And so the taller the lobe here, the more it's going to push the lifter and rocker arm, and the more it's going to open that valve. So the lift is actually determined by how far the lobe is above, or how far this lobe protrudes above the base circle. That's what lift is. Pretty simple to understand. You've heard the term high lift cam, no doubt. Well, that means that this has a big lobe. It's bigger than the normal camshaft or a stock type camshaft, and it's going to open the valve more. Now, that may or may not be something that you want to have going on in your engine. Too much lift with the wrong kind of cylinder heads and the wrong kind of induction system is not good. The lift of your valve has to actually be mated or paired up, if you will, with the correct type of cylinder heads. So here's what happens. So let's say this is an intake valve, okay? This is actually an exhaust valve, but hypothetically, let's say it's an intake valve. So your valve is closed. So normally, let's say you just have like a cam that has 450 thousandths of lift. In other words, that's how far the valve is going to open, 450 thousandths. And you decide you're going to go out and buy a cam. Well, you know, I want a big camshaft, so you go buy something. You find a camshaft that has flames on the box, and oh, it's got 600 lift. Ooh, okay. So you put that camshaft in, and you discover that your engine actually doesn't make more power. It makes less. The reason for that is you can't just take a high performance cam and slap it in a motor. Now, there are camshafts you can put in your engine that will greatly improve its output. But it is also possible to go too large. So you don't want to just go find the biggest camshaft you can find and stick it in a stock type engine, because it's going to hurt your performance. And let me explain to you why it's going to hurt your performance. It's going to hurt your performance because your cylinder head, so say this is an intake valve, there's an intake port coming up here and air is rushing in. When this valve opens, air rushes in past the valve into your cylinder down here. Well, your head or your cylinder head port is only going to flow a certain amount of air depending on your lift of your valve. So at some point, what's going to happen is the valve head and the port are going to become saturated, or they're going to reach a saturation point. Now let me explain what that means. You guys can rewind this if you need to, because I know this is a lot of information. But your air is coming in. At a certain point in your lift, the head is going to lose its ability to put more air in. In other words, the airflow numbers, instead of increasing the amount of air that goes in, if I open this too far, the air numbers are going to start to revert, and you're actually going to be putting less air in, because that port is only capable of flowing so much air. So if I put a big lift cam in, let's say I have a head and it has a 450 lift cam in it from the factory, and those heads actually flow their optimum CFMs at around 450 thousandths of lift, about right there. If I put a cam in that's going to push this valve open a lot further, and I'm exaggerating there, my head port was maxed out at 450 thousandths, but I'm opening my valve to 600. Now I'm wasting all of that rocker arm motion. I'm using horsepower to compress the spring even further, and I'm not getting more air into the cylinder. I am exerting horsepower to actuate the valve train, but I'm not gaining power because the airflow into the cylinder is actually decreased. So hopefully that makes sense. So it is possible to put too big of a cam in a motor. Camshaft selection should always be based on, number one, the intended purpose of the vehicle, and also, very important, is you need to really understand the flow capability, or literally the flow numbers of your head. If you have a set of heads, you put them on the flow bench and they max out at 450 lift, you don't want to put a 600 lift cam in that motor, because you're actually going to make less power. You're going to be exerting engine horsepower, and so hopefully you understand that concept. So lift is actually how far the valve is going to open. That's that distance above the base circle. That's lift. Okay. if we look at our cam card here on this camshaft here, and this is a pretty big engine, it's over 500 cubic inches. I have 650 thousandths of lift on my intake valve. But again, this is a 500 cubic inch engine, so I'm filling a big cylinder, and it's got really big, well-breathing heads on it. So that would be considered a pretty big camshaft for a street car, anyway. Okay, so now the next thing is, you may have heard the term lobe separation. Okay, lobe separation, angle. Lobe separation is literally the distance between the center line of the intake lobe and the center line of the exhaust lobe. How many degrees is between the center line to the center line? That's lobe separation. Now, that can be varied. Okay, if I have wider lobe separation, let's say we ground this camshaft, the crank grounder, manufactured this crank and reground it on their grinding machine, and they made these lobe centers further apart. That means that you would have bigger lobe separation, more degrees between the center lines of these two lobes. Now, lobe separation is important because lobe separation affects overlap. Now, overlap is the period of time that the intake valve and the exhaust valve are open at the same time. So what happens in your cylinder is you have a piston here, and we'll go through the 4 strokes. So we go down on the intake stroke. As we're going down on the intake stroke, what happens is the intake valve opens, right? And the piston draws in the intake charge because of negative pressure. The next step is the intake valve closes, the piston comes up and it compresses that mixture. Because the valves are closed, we have a sealed chamber here. It compresses the mixture, spark plug fires, bang! That ignition ignites the fuel forces the piston back down in the cylinder. That's the 3rd stroke. Then we have the exhaust stroke. Now, in the exhaust stroke, the exhaust valve opens and the piston's coming up and it's pushing all the exhaust out. Well, before the exhaust valve closes, the exhaust valve will start to close, the intake valve over here is going to open. And now I have my intake and exhaust valves both open at the same time. The amount or the number of degrees of crankshaft rotation that those two valves are open is called overlap. Overlap is very important because what it does is it scavenges the cylinder. It helps to pull in air-fuel charge, and the air-fuel charge coming in helps to evacuate exhaust out of the cylinder. So the overlap period is actually affected by lobe separation. So the overlap period on the cam is going to be right in here where these two lobes are intersecting with each other above the base circle. So if I have wider lobe separation, in other words, I grind these and I put the center lines further apart, that is going to diminish the amount of overlap I have. And it's going to change the power band of the engine. It will also change how the engine idles. Wide lobe separation is going to have a tendency to make a camshaft build more low-end torque. Narrow lobe separation and also wide lobe separation will make the idle smooth out as well. Narrow lobe separation, if I bring these center lines in real close, I'm actually building up this area or putting these lobes closer together, which makes the overlap increase. I have more degrees of overlap now because these are closer together. What that does is it actually builds more high-end horsepower, and it causes some of the low-end torque to drop off, and it will also make the engine idle rough. It'll give you a rough ride. So real tight lobe separation, 102, 104 degrees, is usually kind of a rough idling cam. If I want to smooth out that idle and get a little more low-end torque, I can get a cam that has wider lobe separation, 112, 114 degrees. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, another very important spec is center line. Okay, so we talked about how lobe separation is the distance between the center line of this lobe and the center line of this lobe. If we draw a line through the center of the lobe all the way down through the center of the camshaft, the number of degrees from the center line around to the center of the camshaft here, that number of degrees right there is called my lobe center line, and in this case it would be intake lobe center line. And over here from the exhaust lobe all the way down here to the center of the base circle, that however many degrees that is my exhaust lobe center line. Now, if you figure out your intake lobe center line and your exhaust lobe center line, you can use those two numbers to calculate your lobe separation. And that's something that's done when you degree the cam. I'm going to do another video on cam degreeing, but I want to keep that separate because that's a pretty intense video. Cam degreeing is not a simple process, at least not when you're learning it. Once you learn it, it's like riding a bike and it's simple. But in the beginning stages, when I teach cam degreeing, people are like, what? It takes them a while to pick it up. So we won't get into cam degreeing just yet. But here's the thing. So if I degree my cam and I discover I have 104 degrees, right, of intake lobe center line, and I do the exhaust lobe center line and I discover I have 118 degrees, which is, those are just hypothetical numbers, but there are cams that are, that's in the ballpark. What I discover, so let's take a look at this. So we said that we have intake lobe center line is 104 degrees. That's from the base circle to the center of the lobe. And my exhaust lobe center line from the base circle to the center of the exhaust lobe was 118 degrees. I add those two numbers together. I add them together. I get 222 degrees if I add the intake lobe center line and the exhaust lobe center line. Then you take, to get your lobe separation, you divide 222 by 2, or you cut it in half, and we get a lobe separation of 111 degrees. That's how you do it. So if you degree the cam and you get your intake lobe center line, your exhaust lobe center line, add them together and divide them by 2, and boom, you got your lobe separation. Okay, so let's talk about duration. Now, you've heard, we've talked about lift, we've talked about lobe separation, we've talked about intake and exhaust lobe center line, and later we'll talk about why these are important. You know, some of you are thinking out there, well, you know, who cares? Why does it matter? Oh, it matters a lot because these things all affect how the cam performs in the engine and just exactly what it does. Okay, so now we got to talk about duration. So when you say the term duration, okay, what we mean when we say duration, if I asked you, hey, what's the duration of this video? Okay, let's say this video lasts 15 minutes, hypothetically. You'd say, oh, well, the duration of that video is 15 minutes. In other words, it's a period of time. Okay, that is exactly what duration is on the cam. It is a measurement of time, or literally distance, but we call it duration. It's the amount of time. Duration is the amount of time that the valve is open. So from the time the valve leaves the seat, fully extends, and then closes again. That is duration. What transpired during that period of time? In other words, how many degrees did the crankshaft rotate from the time the valve went, boop, opened up all the way, and then shut again? That is literally the duration of the cam. Now, camshaft degrees, for the most part, are measured in crankshaft rotation, not camshaft rotation. It's important that we understand this. Now, I have a timing set here, and you'll notice that the gear for the cam is much larger than the gear for the crank. It's literally twice as many teeth here. And the reason is because the camshaft turns half the speed of the crankshaft. So for every 1 revolution of this crankshaft, the cam only turns 1/2 of a revolution. For every 2 full rotations of the crank, the camshaft will turn 1 revolution. So in other words, when the crankshaft rather is running 6,000 RPMs, the camshaft is only turning 3,000 RPMs. The camshaft, and that's how they put this big gear on, they gear it down. So it's important to understand that even though we're talking about the camshaft specifications on our cam card here, it's important to understand that most of the camshaft specs that you look at are measured in crankshaft degrees, not camshaft degrees. Remember, this turns half the speed of the crank. That's why when you see somebody degreeing a crankshaft, the degree wheel is actually bolted to the crankshaft, not the camshaft. And the reason we bolt the degree wheel to the crankshaft and we measure crankshaft degrees is because literally what we're doing is we want to know what this valve does in relationship to where this is. So basically cam degreeing is we are fine-tuning or literally adjusting when this valve opens based on where your piston is. So you can advance your camshaft, which means this valve is going to open sooner. That means the piston will be further down in the hole when it starts to open. If you retard the camshaft timing, that means that this valve is going to open later. The piston will be up closer to it when the valve starts to open. Now, that makes a big difference in the way that the engine performs, obviously. And so we can actually tune by advancing the cam slightly, which makes the valve open sooner, or retarding the cam, which makes the valve open later. We can actually tune the power band of the engine that way. And so that's why cam degreeing is so important. Another reason cam degreeing is so important is because you may have a cam card that looks like this, and you go to degree the cam and you find out that the camshaft that's in that box doesn't match this because it's misboxed. I've had that happen to me several times. If I hadn't degreed it, the engine would not have performed like it was supposed to because they actually had the wrong camshaft in the box. People do make mistakes. Another thing is I've had camshafts out of the box that didn't match this cam card when I degreed the cam, and come to find out that the camshaft actually was defective. It had some kind of a defect from the manufacturer. If you don't degree the cam, you're never going to find this out. Plus, you're not going to be able to fine-tune your power band unless you degree this cam. So hopefully all that stuff makes sense. Now, duration. Duration is literally, so remember, we're going to bolt our degree wheel to the cam gear here. So we have our crank gear rather, we have a degree wheel bolted to the crankshaft, so we're checking crankshaft degrees. Duration is literally how many degrees the crankshaft down here rotated. So our degree wheel is hooked up to how many degrees did this crankshaft rotate while the valve was open? And we check that with a dial indicator, obviously. So duration of the cam, let's say that you have a 260 degrees of advertised duration. Okay? And we'll talk about duration at 50 thousandths and advertised duration. Let's look at our cam card here. Our cam card here for this cam says that we have, what do we got here? We have 236 degrees of duration at 50 thousandths. So what that means is we're going to open the cam, we're going to rotate our degree wheel, and we're going to bring it up until the valve opens 50 thousandths of an inch. So we're going to come off the base circle with our lifter up to 50 thousandths. Once we get up to 50 thousandths on here, then we're going to start reading our degree wheel. So from 50, let's say there was 50 thousandths here, we're going to go all the way around and open the cam, and we're going to stop at 50 thousandths before the valve closes, and we're going to look at how many degrees the crankshaft rotated. So literally duration is how many degrees did this crankshaft rotate, and crankshaft's rotating down here, how many degrees did this crankshaft rotate while the valve was open from the time it left the seat till the time it closed? But we have to have a reference point. That's why it says duration at 50 thousandths. So what we do is we rotate our wheel, we have a dial indicator up here on the cam and the rocker, and we rotate the degree wheel until the valve comes off of the seat 50 thousandths. At 50 thousandths right there, we look at our degree wheel and we make a mark on it, and then we continue to rotate, and we rotate until the valve opens, and when we get to 50 thousandths before the valve closes, we stop and we look at our degree wheel. So literally, how many degrees did this crankshaft rotate while the valve open from 50 thousandths all the way open and back to 50 thousandths before close. That's duration at 50 thousandths. Advertised duration is basically the same thing, only we only come off the seat a small amount, maybe 5 thousandths, maybe 6. We just barely come off the valve, and the manufacturer will tell you how many degrees to come off of the seat with your valve. I hope this is making sense. I know this is complex stuff, but it's important to know. And you can rewind this if you want and go over this material again. Duration of the cam is how many degrees does the crankshaft rotate while the valve is open. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay, so we talked about duration, we talked about lobe separation, we talked about intake lobe center line, and here's another one. This is duration at 50 thousandths. So literally we're going to rotate this till the valve comes up to 50, right? Our lifter's coming up here, our valve starts to open right here, our lifter's coming around, boom! We look on our indicator, the valve's open 50 thousandths, and from this point all the way over to this point, as we're rotating the engine, we're looking at the degree wheel. How many degrees does the crankshaft rotate from 50 thousandths on the opening side to 50 thousandths on the closing side? That's duration at 50 thousandths. Alright, so hopefully that helps you. We're going to do more on this. I'm going to probably add to this. We're going to have a cam degreeing video where we actually degree a cam. But you need to watch these camshaft specifications and degreeing videos in sequence because they kind of build on each other. And if I just did a cam degreeing video right now, it wouldn't make sense at all to you. I know that the cam specs and all the degree and everything doesn't make total sense to you now. I understand that. But at least you have some idea of what these cam specs mean. So what you're looking at here is a degree wheel. We have a pointer, and then like we talked about, there's a dial indicator set up on the lifter itself. This is a shaft that goes down to the lifter. We also have a dial indicator on the piston itself to find top dead center on the piston. And if you look at the degree wheel here, you can see that the degree wheel is actually bolted to the crankshaft. So make sure you subscribe below and stay tuned. We're going to have more cam degree videos coming up, and we'll get into this cam degree stuff soon.